Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Tamsin Rose, and I have the pleasure of being the moderator for today's session. We know that many people have joined because they're interested in finding out more. So we had about 600 people who registered to attend. So we know there's a huge appetite out there. So let me just explain how this will work. So I'm your moderator, and I will guide you through this afternoon session. We will begin by having a presentation which will help us to understand what happens when we ran a test scenario. Now, you probably know that the EU HTA regulation has to enter into force in January 2025. So we're counting down and we've got about 6 or 7 months left. And when the regulation was being drafted, oncology drugs were one of the areas that were prioritized for the first set of medications that should be subject to this new process. So we're going to present to you what happens when we run a pilot study to try and take through 2 existing drugs to see how might they work in the new system, what might happen. And this is a first attempt to see how this might be applied. And this is important because between now and January, all of the member states have to get themselves ready. They have to be ready to implement this. And there's a lot of uncertainty. To get the regulation ready, we needed to have 6 implementing acts that tell us how different parts of the system will work, and only some of them have been published so far. So what we're doing today is we're giving you the opportunity to see and learn from the experience of testing out how it might work. And then we have a panel who I'll introduce a little bit later, who will help us explore what are the implications of this pilot study? What does it mean for the different stakeholders? Just some housekeeping about this webinar. It is being recorded and it will be available for you to watch again and to share and disseminate via the YouTube channel of FPA, who will also be promoting it on other social media. We are delighted to have so many of you joining us, and we will give you an opportunity to participate. So we're inviting you to use the Q&A, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. That is for questions that you would like to submit to our speakers. The chat is for any technical questions. If you've got a problem or you need some technical support, it's using the chat function. Questions for our speakers later will be via the Q&A function, and we'll be keeping an eye on that. So this is the background of what we're going to do. I'm very pleased to see so many of you here today. And what we're going to try and do is find our way forward together. We are all moving into unknown territory, whether it's the EU regulators, the national regulators, it's the health technology assessments, the clinicians, the patients, industry. We're all moving out of our comfort zones into an area that nobody quite knows how it will work. But it's worth bearing in mind the original intention of the regulation. The aim of the regulation is to simplify the system, to make sure that we can make it more efficient and streamlined, and to make sure patients get access to innovative new treatments as quickly as possible. So that's what everyone is aiming for. What we're going to discuss today is, are we likely to achieve that aim with what we know about how the regulation might be transposed into national law? And if we think there are unintended consequences that could still be addressed in the next 6 months, we'll be identifying that in today's session. So that's what we're going to do together, and we will run until 2 o'clock. So that's the time frame of our activities. So I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker. That's Tanya Podkonyak from Takeda and the FPA Oncology platform. She's going to take us through what we learned through this amazing first pilot study and what lessons we should learn. So Tanya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tamsin, and thank you for the opportunity to present the project that I co-led with my partner from GSK, Ekaterini Femeli. So as Tamsin said, my name is Tanya Podkonyak. I work for Takeda Oncology, but today I'm here representing the FPA Oncology platform, who partnered with Evidaria to conduct this research. So for those who are not familiar with the FPA Oncology platform, it is a disease-wide platform that brings together 20 companies and 17 national trade associations who do various projects and activities together to achieve one vision, which is that every patient in Europe has timely access to the cancer care that they need. But now on to the project. Next slide, please. Why did we set out to do this? So as Tamsin said, the regulation is going to be effective for oncology medicines in just about 7 months' time. So we wanted to take the time to understand the impact that the HTA regulation would have on new oncology medicines by specifically applying the UNEDA 21 methodological guidelines that were published over the last 2 years, jointly together to understand what will be some of the gaps, what will be some of the challenges that will have to be overcome, and what are some recommendations we can make and learnings to make sure that JCAs are workable for oncology medicines from the beginning. So our specific objectives were to first explore the impact of the UNEDA 21 proposed methods, which included picoscoping, but not just the scoping. We went one step beyond, looked also at what does this mean for what kinds of evidence would be needed, what sources of evidence, how real-world evidence would play a role, what kinds of analyses would be needed, and also which endpoints would be considered. And we did this by applying the UNEDA guidelines on previously approved oncology treatments, including an advanced therapeutic medicinal product. Based on the learnings, we really wanted to come up with some recommendations about how we can achieve the vision of the regulation that was set out by Tamsin very nicely, and also to identify calls for action on what we can do now to make sure that the regulation is effective and meets the needs of all stakeholders, starting from the very first assessments in 2025. Next slide, please. So in order to do this, we had a very structured approach to simulating a final JCA report. The first step, like for the upcoming JCAs, was to conduct a scoping simulation. So to do this, we first developed a product profile for each medicine that we selected as a case study by building a product profile from publicly available clinical trial information and also from the EPAR. We then attempted to complete a PICO survey by analyzing European guidelines focused on the ESMO guidelines, and also then by looking at national clinical guidelines and national HTA assessments of the medicines that had already gone through this process. To be representative of a European perspective, we made sure that we included the HTA assessments and clinical guidelines from a variety of different European countries. And in total, we looked at 8 countries, which were France, Germany, Spain, Italy, but also Romania, Ireland, Sweden, and Poland. So we had a cross-section of larger countries, smaller countries, cost effectiveness, budget impact, clinical effectiveness countries, so that we had a good representation of what the European need would be. Based on these insights, we created PICOS tables for each of the countries and the European perspective. And then we took an approach to try to combine this into what we would expect the JCA PICO would be by following the UNEDA guideline on scoping, D4.2. And we did take a scenario where we tried to consolidate by removing single country only requests. And you will see what the results of that analysis were. Once we had a scope, we then looked into the evidence that was available, and we considered the evidence versus the following 4 guidelines: direct and indirect treatment comparisons as published by UNEDA, outcomes, applicability of evidence, and finally, validity of clinical studies. To do this, we created a series of structured questions based on the guidance from each of the documents that we compare the data against that was available to try to understand whether or not this requirement will be fully met, partially met, or not applicable. I think what's critical to know for all audience members is that we only consider data that was available at the point of the EMA submission. As we know, JCAs will be happening in parallel with EMA. And although in many situations, further follow-up or other evidence generation activities might answer some of the questions coming from the PICO simulations, we wanted to have a picture of what would it look like in real time if the JCA was happening during the EMA. So we only considered available evidence at the EMA approval. And finally, we simulated our JCA report and highlighted what would be some of the challenges, where are opportunities, and how companies might be able to address these in a simulated JCA report. On to the results. Next slide, please. So to pick our case studies, we also wanted to make sure that we had a really good representation of the different kinds of cancer treatments that might be undergoing a JCA. So we wanted to make sure that we had a representation of orphan diseases and non-orphan diseases. We had cell and gene therapies and also non-cell and gene therapies, and that we had medicines that were coming with a different evidence package available. Some were conducted as RCTs and others as single-arm studies, so that we had a good cross-section of what kinds of evidence packages and medicines might be coming through the process. So to select our simulation, our case studies, we looked at all medicines that were approved by EMA from 2017 to 2021. We then filtered that for those who had undergone and completed HTA assessments and had HTA reports available in the markets that we had specified. And we made sure that we had the representation of the different variants I just discussed, and that we had, of course, permission of the manufacturer to do this assessment. In the end, we selected 3 products that we ran this case study on, and you can see the product characteristics of the 3 products on the right-hand side of the screen. So we had in total 2 medicines with an orphan designation. We had 1 cell and gene therapy, and we had a cross-section between solid tumors and hematologic malignancies. So product X was a solid tumor, whereas product Y and Z were both hematologic malignancies. In terms of the evidence package that was available, there was also a cross-section. So the first 2 products were both studied, came to market in a phase 2 open label study. And the supplementary information was provided and came from real world data or external control arms, whereas product Z was studied in a phase 3 RCT. However, as you'll see from our analysis, we still required a network meta-analysis coming from evidence identified in a systematic literature review in order to be able to fulfill all of the needs that would be needed in a JCA. Next slide, please. This slide summarizes our results in a nutshell. So we considered over 400 products and selected the 3 case studies that I mentioned. But when we looked at those 3 case studies and considered the 6 UNEDA methods and the 8 countries in scope that I mentioned, the results were a really significant number of PICOs that would be needed for each of the medicines. So for the PICOs identified ranged from 16 to 22 to 57 for product Z. If we applied an approach where we just looked at the additive approach from UNEDA. When we tried to filter that down by applying a proposed consolidation step, where we removed requests that would be coming from a single country only, this number did come down, but it was still quite large. So the number of PICOs were 6, 7, and 23 respectively. And we were not surprised by this result because, as we already know, what is available for treatment is a member state competency, and there are a lot of variations from country to country in what treatments are offered. But also when you consider oncology and the fast pace of development, with lots of different chemotherapies available, and also some older treatments where there may be different combinations of chemotherapies that are preferred by one country or even one hospital to another, we were not surprised by this result, and we do believe that it does reflect what oncology medicines are likely to face in the upcoming JCAs, and really the need to make sure that strong clinical input and patient input is included when setting the scope so that the right comparators and the most appropriate comparators are considered. Because of the large variation in the PICOs, what we also found is that the use of evidence synthesis approaches and a wide range of evidence synthesis approaches was required in 100% of the case studies we analyzed. This varied from indirect treatment comparisons, including real-world evidence as a comparator arm, or closed network meta-analyses. Even in the case where we had a randomized control study, because of the large number of comparators that came back, we still would require complex evidence synthesis approaches to be able to meet the needs of all of the PICOs. So it's important that the system is prepared from all stakeholders to be able to conduct this analysis, but also to assess it and make meaningful conclusions from it. And then finally, when it comes to endpoints, of all three of the case studies that we analyzed, although overall survival was a pre-specified endpoint, at the time of EMA review and approval, none of the medicines would be able to meet this requirement for OS at that point in time. OS did become mature over time, but really in order to be able to conduct JCAs, oncology JCAs will need to leverage other oncology relevant endpoints such as progression-free survival, disease-free survival, patient-reported outcomes, and safety. And the HTA reports that we looked at in national assessments did look at other relevant endpoints, and we believe this will be representative of oncology medicines to come. If we take a deeper dive into this huge number of PICOs and what's driving this big variation, next slide, please. This table will walk you through where really the driver of the PICOs is coming from. And it varies from medicine to medicine, and whether it's the population or the comparator that's driving the large number of PICOs. In product X, the first product that we looked at, there were only two populations, but 15 unique comparators could be derived from those two populations. And what makes this really interesting is if you look into the evidence from the EMA, if you look into the EPAR, at the time, there were no treatment options approved by EMA, so nothing had a formal label. And the EMA advice before the company went through a submission concluded that there was no true standard of care for this disease. So, however, when we applied the United proposed approach, we came up with 15 unique comparators and 16 PICOs. So the two don't marry up, which is why it's really critical to make sure that we have the right expertise in the room when the PICO is being set. Product Y, on the other side, the large number of PICOs was driven by the unique populations. This is a very late stage treatment for hematologic malignancy, and patients could have gone through different treatment pathways to get to that stage, and each one could have constituted a different subgroup of subpopulation depending on how you define it. And then product Z was driven by both a large number of subgroups and also a large number of comparators, 23 to be exact, if you look at all of the different variations of treatments that are used across the European landscape. What's very interesting about product Z is this medicine was studied in an RCT, and to pick the comparator, the company did seek early advice. However, by the time that the medicine was, the trial had read out and the medicine was going through the approval process, the standard of care had shifted. And there was a new standard of care, a new treatment recommended by regional and global guidelines. So even though advice was sought, due to the dynamic landscape of oncology, that comparator had now shifted to something else. And this is really key for us to learn from, because we do believe that this is representative of many areas in oncology, and it calls on the need to have regular advice and opportunity to have dialogue with the assessors throughout the development of a medicine. Next slide, please. So taking into conclusion, we focused on these 5 key areas of recommendations where we can see opportunities to improve the process and to make the first JSCs efficient for all stakeholders. The first is meaningful and timely involvement of health technology developers, clinical experts, and patients. I think you can see from the evidence and the study that we conducted that it's really critical to have the right experts in the room, the right experts available for the assessors to consult with, to make sense of the multiple different treatments that are available and treatment pathways for patients, so that truly European representative PICOs can be requested and assessed in a JCA. Moving on to the second one, the scoping process is critical, the huge number that you saw there. What we really need and what we're asking for is optimized evidence-based scoping process, where we have a methodology that member states and all stakeholders can follow in order to determine how to pick the appropriate comparators and populations, and also a transparent method about how this can be consolidated to an EU level. What I showed you today was one approach, which was by simply removing single member state requests. but this is not certain, and we don't have any visibility about how this would look like. So having transparency there would really help all stakeholders prepare appropriately. Next is comprehensive and flexible advice to accommodate for the changes in the oncology landscape. As we saw in product Z, having advice is important, but the treatment landscape does change throughout the many years of development. So being able to go back and seek advice once something has changed, but not only talk about the clinical trial, but also all of the other evidence generation activities that will accompany that clinical program will be critical. State-of-the-art methodology and using all available evidence will really be a mainstay of all our JCAs. We saw from our analysis that even with an RCT, the requirement for complex analysis will be there for oncology. So it's important that we learn from the best and we utilize state-of-the-art methods, most innovative approaches, and use all evidence to be able to get a full picture and inform our JCAs. And finally, totality of oncology endpoints should be considered in an EU HTA. As we saw, OS data may not be mature, but there are a plethora of other oncology relevant endpoints that were captured in the study, and all of these can help to inform a JCA report. Thank you for the time, and Tamsin, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Tanya. That was a whirlwind of a tour of what was clearly a very carefully worked through document. And thank you for helping us understand methodology and explain just how complex this whole area is. Let me invite the two other people who are going to join us on the panel to explore a little bit more about this. So I'd like to welcome Robin Doorsvik, who is the Head of European Affairs for the European Hematology Association, and Josephine Mosset, who is working on policy at the Cancer Patients Europe, who is replacing Antonella Cardoni, the Executive Director, who's not able to be with us today. So welcome to both of you. The first thing I'd like to find out from you is what's your reaction to the report that we've just had set out, which set out really the complexity and the many different things to take into account. Robin, can I invite you to go first? What do you feel when you've just listened to that?
Thank you, Tamsin, and hello, everyone. And thank you to FPA for conducting this research, which I think is very insightful, confirms a lot of the kind of questions we have, but also opportunities and challenges we see in EU HTA. I think, I mean, that we agree with some of the findings would seem quite obvious, like structural and substantial involvement of clinical experts, the need to kind of limit the number of PICOs. But what particularly resonates with us are the findings that kind of confirm that it's crucially important that comprehensible and flexible advice is taken in, it's absolutely critical to accommodate the shifting standards of care. I think especially in hematology, it is developments go so fast, standards of care shift really, really quickly. And that needs to be accommodated, needs to be, so the methodologies, the procedures need to be adapted to this. In addition, of course, making use of all available evidence and comparators, outpoints, that is, of course, very important. So I think this is very much in line with how we look at the joint clinical assessments and what we see as the main challenges.
Thank you very much. Just a reminder to our audience, this is being recorded, this webinar. It will be available on the FPA YouTube channel, and of course the PowerPoint will also be made available to you. So all of this material, and there was a link in the chat earlier, maybe we'll repeat it again. There was a link to the full report so people can download it and digest it, because there's a lot of information in that. Josephine, please, from a patient's perspective, we saw just how complex this system is. What did you feel when you looked at that presentation?
Thanks, Tamsin. So from a patient perspective, what we see is that the results of the report show that the situation is alarming because there are still too many gaps to fill in the process and methodology for an impactful JCA. At this stage, we believe that the process could not only delay the quality of approvals, but also delay approvals themselves, thus becoming a barrier for access to new treatments across Europe. On the recommendations themselves, we echo the report's recommendation for the meaningful and timely involvement of patients in scoping meetings to ensure that the most representative European treatment practices and relevant patient outcomes are reflected in the final scope joint clinical assessments. We also welcome and echo the report's recommendation to leverage state-of-the-art methodology and all available evidence for JCA assessors to consider the totality of data submitted. We are deeply concerned that the adopted methodology of the JCA would deem the datasets on which most ATMPs are authorized as too unreliable and uncertain to be factored into clinical assessments. And so as patients, we urge for all relevant available evidence, including single-arm trials and real-world evidence, to be considered.
Thank you, Josephine, for that first reflection on the results of the simulation. And this is, I think, the first sort of publicly released attempt to try and understand what would happen if you apply the information that we've received so far, particularly applying the UNETA guidelines on what we'd want to do. So in this next sort of block of conversation, I'd like us to think a little bit, you know, the time is ticking away. January 2025 is approaching really, really fast. So we're going to try and work out, you know, what still needs to be done over the next few months to get the system ready in time. So what needs to be fixed now? What keeps you up at night? What is the thing that you find most concerning? And Tanya, maybe I could start with you because you're the one who knows that report best. You've sat through it. Probably your nightmares are already very fresh in your mind. What still needs to be done?
Thanks so much. Yes, and you know, I am one of many companies who are currently preparing for the first submissions. It takes years to build these, to do the robust evidence package and to prepare a dossier. So companies are not waiting. We have to start right now. So I think the thing that keeps me up at night is the predictability of what will be needed, which PICOs data analysis will be required, combined with a very, very compressed timeline where we will have a maximum of 100 days or 60 days in an accelerated approval or type 2 variation to prepare a dossier. And I emphasize the words maximum because the length of your clock stops, your strategy for your EMA submission could make that even shorter. That really keeps me up at night because right now, as health technology developers, we are not involved in scoping. We don't have transparency of what the PICOs will be like. So we have to do a lot of work at risk and try to guess and anticipate and hope we get it right about what this process will need. It's not a very efficient use of resources. It doesn't simplify the process, which is one of the stated objectives, as you said at the beginning of the session. So from us, one of the biggest burdens is our teams when it comes to our biostats teams and our global outcomes research teams to try to go through a large number of PICOs in a short amount of time to make sure that we still have a high quality, robust dossier. What I hope can fix it is dialogue and engagement. We have seen the first implementing act for joint clinical assessments. There was a strong response for the community, I think about almost 130 responses, but I think it fell short from taking those on board. We still have 5 other implementing acts going on. One is happening right now, a public consultation for conflicts of interest. I think we have an opportunity to bring all members of the community together to make this a workable process. You know, for the conflicts of interest one, we have to make sure that the right people are in the room, that the JC assessors can rely on, and excluding those who may have been an investigator in a trial or have the most experience with a medicine is not necessarily the best approach. It's important that we manage conflicts of interest and we are transparent with them, but it's critical that those right people are in the room. And I think we can get there. And also with the outstanding methodological guidelines, we've only seen one And we are urging the coordination group to release the others so that we can start preparing and get ourselves ready for those first assessments.
Thank you. Robin, let me bring you in. What keeps you up at night when thinking about this? Maybe you sleep like a baby, I don't know, but we're inviting you to think about that.
I'm still sleeping well, thank you. But there are some things that we are concerned about, absolutely. Also from the point of view of involvement of clinical experts and medical societies. We are very eager for more clarity. But perhaps more than anything, it is the question whether we can really live up to say the expectations, and not only from the HTA bodies and other stakeholders, when it comes to how medical societies can help bring in the right experts and help make the system a success, but also very much the expectations that we have of our own role. Can we live up? Can we realize for ourselves the role that we as medical societies see for ourselves? We feel a responsibility to help make EU HTA a success. We think it is crucially important that it becomes a success if we want to improve affordable access to innovative therapies for patients in hematology and related areas. But there are a lot of potential obstacles. Tanya emphasized it already. It will be extremely important to bring the right people into the room. Concretely, for us, that means identifying and involving the best available clinical experts. Of course, also we very much want the patient experts to be involved, but I'll let Josephine talk about that. To involve the right clinical experts, there is the huge conflict of interest challenge. I'm sure we'll be getting back to that topic in a bit, but also timelines. That is perhaps the thing that makes us most nervous. We don't want to be the ones delaying the assessments. We cannot be the ones. Timelines are important and crucial. Yet involving leading experts is also very challenging. Clinical experts, they tend to treat patients, lead studies, teach at university. They participate in international expert networks. So to get them to free themselves up at very short notice with tight timelines, formalities to be processed, that will be really challenging. So clarity there too on where and exactly how as medical societies we will be allowed to help, really, because the legislation foresees involvement of individual experts, not expert organizations, in the joint scientific consultations and joint clinical assessments. But I think it is crucially important that we as European medical societies who have the best overview of where those best experts can be found, that we are involved structurally in a timely fashion. And that clarity on all aspects of the joint clinical assessments will be provided soon, so that we can prepare our community, make sure they are all aware of how the joint clinical assessments will work, why they are important. So timelines and conflict of interest are probably the key concerns.
Thank you very much. And you've highlighted that there is maybe a gap between your own expectation of what you could contribute under the best of circumstances and the reality of the timelines, and the fact that, as an institution, as an organization, you may have a lot of capacity, but people input as individuals, and there's that challenge to deal with managing that. Josephine, let me bring you in from the perspective of patients. What's the biggest concern?
So first of all, I think I'm just going to, I join Robin in his concern about timelines. We are very concerned about this. I mean, for the time being, there is only one implementing act that has been published, the one on the JCA. The draft act on conflict of interest is currently under consultation, but there's still 4 more to go and not a lot of time to address all the ambiguities. Then when it comes from a patient perspective, well, right now we notice that there are currently no clear guidelines for the involvement of patients in the JCA. And there really is an urgent need for the involvement to be both clarified and standardized. So this includes, how will the patients be recruited? When will the patient input be requested? And how would it be taken into account? And then finally, patient experts need a baseline of timely, clear, and accessible information on the treatment and decision-making problem they are being asked to address. In our answer to the consultation on the draft JCA Implementing Act, we had asked for plain language summaries, otherwise known as summaries of information for patients, SIPs, to be included in the JCA to encourage patient input. Unfortunately, this call, which was also issued by several other patient groups, has been completely ignored. And this for us raises the question of whether our input into all these consultations is only an intellectual exercise and if it really has any use at all. So it goes towards your next question about the conflict of interest, but very much we do raise this question, are we being listened to?
Okay, thank you. Josephine and Robin, I'm going to ask you just in 1 minute to give a comment on, as you said, this new implementing act for the conflict of interest was put out to public consultation. So that means it's not final yet. It's being consulted. Josephine, you've just said, look, when we asked for something that would make it more accessible for patients to actually engage, it didn't get acted on. So you've got real questions about the extent to which your views are taken into account. But on this message about the conflict of interest framework, do you which is very tight in the way they've defined a conflict of interest, do you feel there could be unintended consequences? Might it affect the quality of the JCA work? Josephine.
Yes.
Apologies, I was going to let Robin. So, the objective of including patients in the JCA is to enhance transparency, legitimacy, and fairness. However, the conflict of interest framework only includes individual patients in opposition to patient organization. And you got to remember, the bureaucracy involved in filling declarations of interest forms stating all potential conflicts of interest is a lot more difficult to achieve as an individual in comparison to a representative from an organization which functions under transparent rules. And so these additional administrative burdens placed on the patients, as well as all the strict conditions listed in the framework, can be a deterrent for any patient, and this affecting their participation and the overall quality of the work. So this would be especially the case if the administrative process had to be repeated at the national level.
Okay, thank you. So you've raised some very practical issues. If the information isn't provided in plain language that's accessible to patients, and individuals have to fill out endless bits of paperwork about their conflict of interest, which is much harder for them, then this could be a barrier. Robin, I'm sure you probably echo some of those points for clinicians who are no less busy than patients. So what would be your concern?
Well, for a start, it's quite obvious that if we don't manage to involve the best available experts in this joint HTA work, that will go at the expense of the ultimate quality of the joint assessment reports. And we all want them to be of the best possible quality to have optimal impact and credibility. I think, you mentioned the draft implementing act. I think, there's a few things we could remark about that, but ultimately it is really how it is implemented. Is there any flexibility in how that implementing act is interpreted and applied? And there needs some flexibility that needs to be there. That is quite obvious, especially for rare and ultra rare diseases. There's only a small number of leading experts across all of Europe. And if all of them are ruled out by very strict interpretation of conflict of interest, you'll end up without the expertise that you really need to make these joint assessments a success. So we need pragmatic management of conflict of interest with room for determining this on a case-by-case basis, rather than trying to rigidly ban all conflict of interest. Transparency obviously is key.
Thank you. And now to all members of the panel, if we could influence the to-do list of the Commission and the coordination group and put some things to the top of their list, what else are you looking for? What are there certain topics that must be tackled before 2025? Tanya, would you like to start us off? What should be the top of their to-do list?
Sure, I have a couple. We mentioned the methodological guidelines. We've seen one. I think we're expecting at least another 9 by the end of the year. Unfortunately, there wasn't stakeholder engagement for this one. And I think we would first ask for transparency on when those are coming, because as I said, we're already making decisions and putting together dossiers completely blind to what will be needed. If not a public consultation, then let's use a stakeholder network that is a formal body to look at and consult on those upcoming methodological guidelines. And then secondly, it's moving to the national implementation. You yourself have been to many of the national info days. I think we are seeing a diversity in where countries are in terms of their readiness. And it's really critical that we get that right and that we use 2024 for countries to identify what will change, what will I replace on my national system? Will it be a step? Will I change the structure of my dossier so I'm not duplicating this information? How will I use the JCA report to issue my final value rating so I can just move to that step and to then the economic assessment? And is this a guideline change or is it a legislative change? We know we have elections coming up. A lot of countries have national elections coming up. These are the conversations and decisions that if I was in front of health ministers, I would urge them to have now so that we're not waiting till 2024, 25 to have these. It takes some time to do all of these policy changes. And this has to happen today. And a key part of that is very practical, but this IT platform, the submission point, how will the information, we haven't seen it as stakeholders. I think it's a call also for all of us to have a chance to test it. How will the information we submit on this IT platform trickle down to the national HTA agencies? Some of these practical challenges we can resolve, and I think we need to come together and resolve them pretty quickly.
Thank you. So some practical suggestions, but you asked, I thought, a really great question, which is that at national level, are we properly asking, what am I going to replace? What am I going to take out of the existing things that I'm doing so that we can slot in the JCA? And if they haven't got clarity on that, then there's obviously going to be some duplication of activities there. Robin, let me invite you to also answer that. What else are you looking for from the Commission? We had a plea there from Tanya for transparency, to get those, implementing guidelines, methodology guidelines out as quickly as possible, and then get a sense of the IT platform. Can we test it out? Can we see it? So what would you like to add to that? What's on the top of your wish list?
Sorry, Tamsin, were you asking me or
Yes,
or
I was,
Josephine?
Robin. Sorry, it was for you.
Thank you. I think, yes, I mean, we share many of the same concerns, obviously. I think very, very important is that there will be true harmonization and alignment. Ideally, of course, in practices between the HTA bodies, but very importantly also, for instance, evidence requirements across the whole regulatory spectrum. So across that is very important. Real harmonization and HTA, making EU HTA a success looks like a huge challenge in itself. So it is probably hard to take into account everything that happens before and after HTA, but it will be crucial to the ultimate success and impact. And so alignment with evidence requirements across the whole cycle. That will be really important, but also alignment of practical processes like declaration of interest, already well thought out by EMA, although a little bit under threat of a recent EU Court of Justice decision, which looks like it's forcing EMA to become more cautious in how it puts together ad hoc expert panels. But real alignment in processes, in evidence requirements, and I hopefully ultimately also in attitudes, because that I think is crucial, that there is this awareness that whilst this is a voluntary collaboration on paper between national HTA bodies, that it will only benefit everyone in the field if there is true harmonization.
Thank you. Josephine, last comment on this. What are you looking for from the Commission for the next 6 months?
Thanks, Tamsin. I think for us, really the main point is we strongly believe that patient organizations should be involved in the process. They're representative of a community more than just an individual, and can express collectively information gathered via surveys or focus groups about the side effects or benefits of a specific medicinal treatment. The involvement of organizations can also support the process with more than just one expert. And moreover, there are many treatments, including those targeting pediatric cancers, where the patients themselves cannot be part of the JCA. There really has to be provisions that have to be put into place to address this and to make sure that the patient voice is there. And, pediatric cancers is just one example, but we could make a whole list. And we really need to have that voice that can, transcend those aspects as well.
Thank you. Let's now move into this next block of conversation, where I would like us to look at the main recommendations. And if you remember, there was a lovely visual that showed sort of 5 key recommendations. So we're going to start by looking at the ones that touch on the process. And several of you have already raised questions on that process. But let's start by, Josephine, let's follow up on what you just said, because the report that we got is calling for meaningful and timely patient involvement in JCAs. So from your perspective, what might that look like? How would national patient organizations benefit, from the end of the JCA work?
So, well, the meaningful and timely involvement of patients in the JCAs would take the form of clear and standardized guidelines on how patients can participate in joint clinical assessments, and clear indications of how their input will be taken into account. And we'll never stop repeating this. There needs to be a framework for patient involvement. And for the second part of your question, the JCA reports can become an advocacy tool for patients at national level to advocate for better access to innovative treatments, especially in countries where such treatments would not be made available in the short term. Moreover, specific guidelines for the involvement of patients in the JCA can also be used by patients to advocate for their involvement in HTA at national and regional level.
Thank you. And I think that's quite a good last point, because one thing that I have learned, having moderated all of these information sessions for the HTA at different national levels, is just how rarely patients get a seat at the table in some of the national or regional current processes. So I think that last point is important, that the JCA report is an opportunity to give them a more structured place. Robin, do the challenges that report identified, do they resonate with the clinician community?
Yes, they do. I guess when you say the clinical community, obviously it's a big community, and one of the real challenges will be that whereas we can do some very broad general awareness building on EU HTA, what is it? Why is it important? What can it contribute to? The actual involvement of clinical experts will have to be done on a case-by-case basis. Every assessment will require different expertise. And I think generally the European medical societies, which that's not just EHA, but also others, also work closely with the national medical associations. They're well set up to identify who ideally those clinical experts should be. But because there will not be many clinicians who will be approached very often to contribute to these joint assessments. Every assessment is different. Every disease is different. Every time we will need different experts. So it will come down to being able to move very quickly, not only identify those experts, but also inform them, encourage them to get involved. And in addition to the practical obstacles that we already mentioned, timelines, conflict of interest, what will also be really important is cooperation from their employers, because that's not us as medical societies, that's not the HTA bodies, those are the universities and the hospitals. And that really is something that will require some attention. Because those employers are not generally encouraging their clinicians to free up time, and certainly not at short notice for HTA.
Thank you. Tanya, let me come to you, because obviously we still need a huge amount of clarity between now and January. We've got the recently adopted JCA Implementing Act, the proposal on conflicts of interest, but we've got many more implementing acts and process guidelines to come. What are the process improvements that you hope to see before this act is fully in place in January next year? Because you've made some recommendations. Do you think those process improvements could be made, and what specifically do you think could be taken up as a result of your report?
Sure, thank you. So for focusing on the JCA, I kind of see it as the content that's already in the JCA Implementing Act and maybe what's missing, where we can fill those gaps, and then what's beyond the JCA Implementing Act, where it can really make a meaningful difference. So within the JCA Implementing Act, we don't have the guaranteed health technology developer inclusion and scoping, and we heard from Rob and Josephine that also patients have some concerns there. But there are optional steps that are built in. And so there is a scoping explanation meeting that's built into the process. There is an optional engagement for scoping and during the assessment for stakeholders, including the health technology developer. Knowing that these are optional, but we are in a journey of learning. And first year, all stakeholders will have to learn how to collaborate together. We'll learn by examples. I would really encourage that in each of the first assessments in the initial years, that these optional engagements, these optional interactions that are in the JCAIA are used at every single point. From our perspective as a manufacturer, we have clinical teams that have been involved in this program in this area for years. We have biostats teams that are experts in this data. Why not leverage them at the assessor level to understand what can and can't be done from an analysis perspective to make the JCAs run smoother and be of higher quality? There are some process steps that, like we talked about, PICO consolidation, that's not covered explicitly how that will happen in the Implementing Act, but there is a guideline that we believe is coming up. Can the right stakeholders be built into that guideline, which could be revisited and be a little bit more flexible? And likewise, when questions come to us for additional data analyses, right now the what's going to come and when is uncertain, and we have between 7 and 30 days to provide a response. That's a huge gap. For us to be able to have our teams ready, it's good to have some predictability or some dialogue to understand what's needed, so we can explain right away what can be provided and how much time that will need. Now, looking beyond the JCA Implementing Act, I think there are lots of meaningful lessons we can learn from the 30 years of experience with EMA and from other national authorities. And this really comes down to the engagement before the submission process begins. We notify EMA 7 months in advance that we intend to submit. Why not use this time to identify experts, to get them prepared, to have dialogue about what evidence is available, what analysis is possible, even maybe during horizon scanning, which we know will be a part of this regulation. Why not have those engagements early on with the companies, with all of the stakeholders before the assessments begin, so that we have a smoother ride during the JCA. This EMA already does this, and we have countries like Germany that have regular dossier advice meetings in the year leading up to the assessments. Let's learn from those and built in these pre-assessment steps while we're getting up to speed, I think we can really benefit from them in the long run.
Thank you very much, Tanya. And obviously that's very interesting because you've opened up this fact that we've got post-submission, these really compressed timelines, and yet there's actually a little bit of room in that prior, early consultation conversation where more clarity from the regulator about what exactly they're looking for and what particular issues they want to have addressed would give everyone a bit more time to organize themselves to participate in that. So thank you for that, is suggesting that's an area where we can open up a bit more time, whereas post-submission it's very compressed. Thank you. There are a couple of recommendations in the Evidera report that are more about methodology, and perhaps we could touch on those. There were recommendations that were made that addressed, make sure that you've got state-of-the-art methodology and you're using all available evidence. Make sure that you've got evidence-based scoping, and particularly on the issue of oncology, you want oncology relevant endpoints, for example. So let's pick up on those ones. And Tanya, I'll start with you, because the report put a lot of emphasis on evidence and data that's needed, both from a regulatory point of view and for the JCA. So how do you expect that companies will adapt how they prepare their evidence packages to launch a new innovative therapy following the start of the JCA procedure? Because you've got these, two parallel processes. How are companies getting ready? Is it the same evidence package, different? How's that going to happen?
It's a great question, and companies have been busy doing this work, myself included in my company, for a number of years now. At the heart of it, we have a global development plan for a medicine where most of us are global companies, and we need to meet the needs of all stakeholders, which is not easy. You have give and take. You might have data coming from, we're Japanese, from Japan's health authority, so we have to make trade-offs and balances. JCA is a critical part of that, but in order to anticipate what will be needed, what a lot of us have been doing internally is setting up our own internal PICOs to try to anticipate what will be the needs of a JCA eventually. What's really critical is how do we then take what we get from our countries, make sense of it, of what's going to be likely the EU assessment without having that vision and that clarity of how is the HTA coordination group doing this? So I go back to, we really need that scoping guideline and that consolidation guideline as soon as possible. But even once we have that input, making those decisions will be really quite challenging. We're going to have to make trade-offs. And I think what we've seen already and what we're preparing for is we're going to have to rely quite a lot on more complex evidence synthesis analyses. We're going to have to rely heavily on real-world data, especially in many oncology areas. If there hasn't been an innovation in a long time and it's very old chemotherapies that are used, we're going to have to somehow synthesize these. So rely quite a bit on indirect treatment comparisons, on assessments with single-arm studies. And the core of this is also literature searches. When do we do them? So internally, we are kind of gearing up and preparing for a larger amount of complex evidence synthesis needed, and how to make those really difficult trade-offs. Now, what would make it a lot easier is if we move towards a more harmonized European level set of needs. Coming to a clinical team that is trying to design a global study and asking for 16 comparators, as we saw in some of the cases, is just not feasible. So the more that we can harmonize in Europe and have a common or a small number of comparators that are truly European, the bigger impact we can have on our influencing our global development plans.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Jasmine, let me turn to you, because obviously the point of the JCA is that we want it to benefit patients at a national level. That's the whole purpose. It's the objective of the regulation. So the work has to be relevant to what matters to patients. So how do you think that the EU's JCA should take into account the perspective of patients on, and this is important, on clinical endpoints that matter most to them? So this is where the patient's voice, because it's their lived experience, is so unique. How should it be taken into account?
Yeah, thanks, Tamsin. So according to, as patient representatives, for us, the EU JCA should consider quality of life endpoints, as well as the indirect impact of therapies. new therapies being assessed as part of the JCA that have the same clinical benefits as other therapies currently on the market should still, according to us, be considered innovative if they provide enhanced quality of life, have less side effects, have easier administrative methods, for example. These are aspects that are absolute priorities for patients. It's not just about improving overall survival. It's allowing us to have a better life, being able to go back to work, have family lives, have our carers, maybe take a step back. And so this can be reflected by taking those quality of life endpoints into account as part of the JCA.
Thank you. Robin, let me ask you from the point of view of the researchers and clinicians, once the JCA is available, and again, the idea is that it helps speed up innovation, getting it to the patients. So what might be the concrete impact if you're a clinician working in a country, you've got patients, and suddenly a JCA falls from heaven and you've got this new document, how might it affect the day-to-day work of clinicians?
Well, what all clinicians are very much hoping for, obviously, is that the joint assessment reports will improve decision making about access, better, faster access, more affordable, but certainly access to the right medicines from a clinical benefit and certainly a patient benefit point of view. So we completely align here with the patient advocates, and as a matter of fact, involvement of clinical experts should always go hand in hand with those of patient experts. For clinicians, all the discussions on evidence requirements, PICO outcomes, etc., very much intertwine with discussions that we are having with EMA, but also just simply within the clinical community. We all need better data, more agreement on use of comparators and outcomes, to make sure that both regulatory and clinical and access decision making is improved. So yes, better access to the most needed innovative therapies from a clinical and a patient perspective.
Thank you. We've been gathering questions as you've been speaking, so we already have 14 questions submitted from our audience. So maybe we'll start to go through a few of those, and let's sort of see. I might actually start. We've had a question that's been submitted from Giedra Pezikiti, if I've pronounced that correctly, which it's one that might be helpful for us to just understand how the process works. Which is, we need to make sure that we understand. We heard that the report means there's a lot of PCOS, and she said, well, is that a bad thing? Surely that's actually quite a good thing, because it means we're thinking about different populations and in different ways it could be used. Can you help us, a layperson, understand why a multiplication of PCOS, it creates a problem? So Tanya, I don't know if that's one you could pick up on.
Yeah, sure, I definitely can. A key challenge is with the data that's available to address them. So we have to look at how was this PICO selected and was it guided by evidence? So if you just look at a policy-based decision, which is anything that's used across the region, you might end up including really old chemotherapy regimens or medicines that we saw in the first case study that have never even been approved by EMA. In those situations, the evidence base that's available to inform those PICOs is really poor. So in the end, you're doing analyses with evidence that potentially you shouldn't be doing analyses for. And in the end, are we conducting and using our resources to our most efficient use? If only a small number of patients are being given this treatment, or there isn't the high quality evidence that you need to be able to conduct this analysis, and the analysis doesn't get used, it's not the best use of resources. I think instead we need to look at and work with our clinical experts and patient experts to understand truly what is the standard of care, and can we move to the best standard of care across Europe to do these comparisons versus the lowest common denominator, which is where we're heading to put some figures on this. An analysis by one of our colleagues that was done through the method subgroup showed that we could go up to over 5,000 different data tables. And there's lots of interesting research done from the German Trade Association that saw what % of all of that analysis is actually used today to meaningfully make decisions. I think we need to take some lessons from there and only ask for the data that we really need to drive decision making versus asking for lots of different complexity of analyses, lots of investment from companies to do this, but also from stakeholders to review this if it's not truly leading to meaningful conclusions.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Let me pick up on, there's a couple of questions that are coming that are all related to rare diseases, saying, and this is both for Josephine and for Robin, I think, because various questions have said, look, the conflict of interest rules are so tight that particularly for rare diseases, is that a risk that for Robin, we end up having clinical experts in the room who are not the experts who deal with it day to day because they have a conflict of interest. So we end up bringing in people with less relevant experience simply because the conflict of interest rules are there. And Josephine, it's the same question for patients. As the patient groups get smaller and smaller for rare and ultra rare, you know, that's a small number of people to try and do meaningful engagement for patients, which takes a lot of time and preparation. So how do you see the application of the JCA and the HTA process, particularly for this rare and ultra rare diseases? Robin, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I mean, this is a crucial question. And as I already mentioned, we are hugely concerned about the tendency on the part of some HTA bodies, and perhaps reinforced by that recent court ruling by the EU Court of Justice regarding an assessment done with an ad hoc expert group set up by the CHMP at EMA. That there is a tendency towards, you know, becoming stricter rather than more flexible, and especially for rare and ultra rare diseases, there really is no alternative to involving those experts that really know what it takes to be able to help with a good assessment. There is no alternative for rare and especially ultra rare diseases. You cannot make use of clinical experts with very general knowledge. It will not get you the quality that we need.
Thank you. Josephine.
Thanks, Tamsin. Maybe 2 points on my end. First of all, when it comes to patient involvement and, you know, the conflict of interest in rare diseases and ultra rare diseases, one thing that everyone needs to remember is that there are so few patients that these patients will more likely than not be involved, you know, in activities leading to conflicts of interest. And as the simple reality of that, if there's a small pool of patients, well, then everyone's going to want to engage with them. So first of all, we need to keep this in mind, and provisions should be also, you know, reflecting this. Secondly, this goes back to my point about engaging with patient organizations versus individual patients, because patient organizations have the capacity to mobilize, they have expertise, they're able to bring together patients that also, you know, some of them might not speak English, some of them might be from more remote areas and couldn't be engaged directly within the process, but very much would have the expertise. And this is where the patient organization can play that role, you know, of the intermediary and provide all of that input. So very much keeping in mind that conflicts of interest cannot be avoided, especially in rare diseases, and patient groups are essential and really need to be the actor that the HTA and the JCA are working with.
Thank you. Tanya, I've got a couple of questions that I'm going to push over to you because I think they're probably your best place to answer. We've had some questions about timing. What happens if a developer doesn't reply in time? Do we know what the consequences might be of an incomplete dossier? If for a specific PICO, a developer can't respond in time in these tight timeframes, do we have any idea what happens?
Sure, I can tell you as far as we know, but I think some of this is still to be developed. And we would welcome even further guidance on this. So once we submit the dossier, there is a completeness check that happens at the first step. And I will remind everybody that as a regulation, it is a requirement for us to submit a joint clinical assessment dossier. So when we're talking to our leadership teams internally, we are telling them if we are going for an EMA, we are doing a JCA. So we have to keep that in mind and put our best efforts forward to realize the initial vision of this process. But if you don't pass the completeness check, according to the Implementing Act, you will be, 15 days later, you will get a request from the assessors asking you for this information, and you will have an opportunity then to provide information that's missing. If there is information that's missing for a specific PICO, there are provisions in the dossier template to explain why that information couldn't be provided. And as I said, there is this step to provide this additional data during the completeness check if you haven't submitted it. Now, in terms of what happens if the dossier is still not complete at that stage, according to the text, the assessment will stop and national assessments will carry on. But there is then the question of if that information is submitted at a national level, there is an opportunity for the JCA to restart again. So I would encourage all to do, put our best efforts forward in the limited time that we have to try to put forward the best quality dossier. And this is why we think that early engagement in the process, even before the process, is really critical for us to be able to meet this timeline. The one that keeps me up the most at night is accelerated approvals and type 2 variations, where without a clock stop, the 60 days that we have become 30 days, which really you're just reviewing the final edits at that stage. So that early engagement is really critical to make sure that we're not in a situation where companies aren't able to provide all the data.
Thank you. Yes, I can see why that keeps you up at night. The idea that a clock can suddenly double in speed and you've got just 30 days. Thank you. Robin, we've got a question, I think, that is specifically named for you. Someone says, asking the JCA to account for changes in the standard of care in future is problematical. So how quickly do standards of care change in hematology, which at this point we're requiring the JCA to be clairvoyant to see in the future? And can you give us a concrete example? You mentioned that actually in the area of hematology, things are moving very quickly, but take us through that process, because my understanding of clinical guidelines is they're incredibly slow. They get updated every 10 years or so, but it sounds like it's happening in lightning speed in your environment.
Yes. That is very true, and a big challenge, to be quite honest. I mean, it takes time to develop clinical practice guidelines. This is done according to thorough methodologies, requires time. We and many other medical societies are building up capacity to do this. But there are many different hematological diseases, and not only malignancies, but also non-malignant diseases. So many diseases to develop clinical practice guidelines on. And by the time some of them are finished, they're almost outdated. So that really is a huge challenge. And then, of course, there is the additional challenge of the discrepancies in standard of care across European countries. And I think we see that responsibility for ourselves to guide the way in terms of what is on balance the European standard of care. But I'm not going to tell you this is easy, and also for us as medical society, we can do this in all areas at the same time and as fast as is needed. So what we see as something that we can do is interact closely also with our national hematology societies and try to convey what we are doing at the European level, and also help them prepare, help them to be ready for adjusting what is done at the European level for the national standards and national processes.
Thank you. Tanya, there's a question that maybe you can answer, because there's somebody who's saying, look, given that we've got these incredibly tight time frames, are there opportunities to use digital tools, so AI, machine learning, anything to help with dossier preparation, literature review, or others? Is there technology out there? Are there things that would make this huge burden of processing and the data, searching it, and putting it together in dossiers? Can we make that easier?
It's a really great question. I think somebody is probably from our leadership team, because that seems to be the hot buzzword. I think eventually, yes, but we're at a point now where we need to converge the regulatory process that's been going on for 30 years with now the access, the HTA process, which used to be sequential, but now it's happening at the same time. So how do we have all of the right teams talking to each other, from more of having the right brain power in the room to set the strategic elements correctly, to make sure that we understand the interplay between the different EMA milestones and then the JCA milestones. And that requires a lot of the right brains being in the same room. So I don't think we can get away from that immediately. Where I think AI can be really useful is helping us understand how does this now fit with the national dossiers, for an example. So which sections of the national dossier do we not need to do because we've already submitted it? And those that require additional evidence, can they be automatically populated? So I think we're in the infancy stages. I also think that some of the methodological guidelines, particularly on how to conduct literature searches, they still require double-blinded review, which is 2 individuals screening. So we need to update some of that. And I think we need to work with our data colleagues to see how we can support the JCA processes, but I don't think in the first instance we'll be able to fully switch. You still need that human interaction and all of those brains in the room to get this right.
Great, thank you. Again, I'm quickly going through the questions that are still coming in. And I think there's the question that might be from Martin that's saying, you know, how will this legislation take into account the reality, which is, and Robin, you raised this, that there are standards of care, but they are often not necessarily implemented fully, and some countries are quite far from that. So if you want to find potential comparators for the PCOS, there may be a challenge because some of these therapies are just, the potential comparators are just not being implemented or are not reimbursed in other countries. So your ability to draw in that information is hampered by the fact that we know that standards of care, even if they exist, are just not being delivered on the ground equally. Robin, I don't know if you want to comment on this.
Yes, although my sound was dropping for a few moments, but I think I got most of the question. It's a crucial question. Now we are, of course, hoping precisely that EU HTA will help address a part of that issue that is described in the question, namely that standards of care are not identical across countries, and this results in part from very different access decisions. There are multiple factors at play, but in part this results from very different access decisions that are made about the same treatments based on the same evidence. And we're hoping, of course, that EU HTA will eliminate some of that randomness in that decision making, that there will be a more harmonized, better evidence basis for making such decisions, so that access at least becomes more harmonized and more equitable. That does still leave a lot of other challenges that also will need to be addressed in order to fully solve this. Affordability is one. I mean, you can agree on the standard of care and make sure that the therapies are accessible, but then they still need to be reimbursed for them to be actually, become available for patients. So EU HTA can address some of this, not all of it.
Thank you. Tanya, let me come to you because we've got a question right at the beginning from Sebastian Gomez that he was asking, do you see the EU JCA acceptability of ITCs differing between clinical trial-based versus using efficacy data from real-world evidence? So it's quite a technical question, but perhaps you can answer that one.
Yes, and so for those who are not aware, the first methodological guideline on direct treatment comparisons came out a couple of months ago now, and this is now the final guideline. It does distinctly show a difference between what's preferred. So the gold standard are randomized control trials. Real world evidence is included, and we expect it will be included in the validity of clinical studies. But unfortunately, there are, we accept, of course, it's not the same as doing an RCT, but I think what our analysis showed is that we will have to rely on this, especially if you have really old chemotherapies that are used, if you have medicines that have never gone through an EMA approval but are used in standard of care, we will have to rely on those RWE sources to be able to answer the PICOs. I think with ITCs, they're maybe largely misunderstood. For me, indirect treatment comparisons are a way to minimize the uncertainty of a certain comparison. If we need to know the answer of A versus B, and we don't have that in direct study, or A versus C, D, E, F, as we saw, ITCs are just a methodology, and there are different ways you can go about it to try to capture that uncertainty and minimize the uncertainty. So these are just tools that assessors can use to be able to draw their conclusions. So although there is a distinction between them, and of course, if you have a controlled setting, it'll be different than a real world evidence setting, both have a place in a JCA, and I think we will need to use both. So assessors, experts, companies, we need to invest in the capabilities to be able to properly use these and make sure that we're using the most innovative methods in Europe, and we're not going to the lowest common denominator.
Thank you. We're coming towards the end of our time together, and it's been a really fascinating conversation together. But I'm going to ask each of the panel to just share in sort of one sentence if there's a single recommendation or message that you would really like to remain with our participants. And also, if we are lucky enough to know the exact location of all the ministers of health in the next week, and we were able to just slip a little post-it note in their briefing packs, what message would you like them to hear from you about the HTA, and what message would you like the audience to take away? So 2 messages I'd like from us all. Tanya, you're on my screen, so let me start with you.
I'll start first. I'm always an optimist. So even though we have some challenges, I think we described them in the report, we're seeing some concerns in the implementing acts. We still have 7 months. And I think the key to making this work is engagement. So for the audience members here, I would say stay engaged, collaborate. We need to have open dialogue with all stakeholders. Working in silos will not get us across the line. We have 5 more implementing acts, lots more methodological guidelines. I would encourage everybody to provide comments, get involved. And I would also ask, we don't unfortunately have somebody from the commission or the coordination group here. The message goes to that side as well. Talk to all of us. I think let's use these 7 months and make this work. For the health ministers, we are in a period of change, and we have to accept that the world next year will not be the same as it is this year. So I would say engage, look at your internal processes nationally, learn and adapt. We all have to change. It won't be easy, but we need to start doing that process now.
Thank you. Robin, what message would you like the audience to take away from today, and what secret message would you put on a post-it for the ministers?
I think the main takeaway is that for the main message that I would like to share with the audience, yes, this is challenging. You know, it's not easy. It's complex. It's daunting. But you know, let's not become pessimistic, but all help make this a success, because it is a crucial component of improving access decision making in Europe and getting patients better access. A message for health ministers, yes, this is scary, you know, letting go of your national competencies. And I know that your HTA bodies all, you know, prefer to stick to their own ways. And bring in their own expert friends, and but no, that is not the way to make this a success. We really need to harmonize and do this together.
Thank you. Josephine, what message would you give from the patients to the people watching today? And then if you could put a message to a minister.
Thanks, Tamsin. Mainly big messages for me. So the first one is a reminder that involving patients in health technology assessment can enhance the transparency, the legitimacy, and the fairness of the JCA. Patients have first-hand experience of living with a condition, so they can provide unique information and insights on the impact on their daily lives and on the risk and benefit of treatments. But this involvement can only be constructive if the patients can provide meaningful inputs with clear indications as to how the input would be used. Maybe one last call is that patient organizations should be involved in the process, as they are representative of a community more than just an individual, and can support the process with more than just one expert. So that's very much a plea. We did not see this reflected in the first Implementation Act, and we're really hopeful that it will be implemented in the next ones.
Thank you very much. So I want to say thank you to all of you as a panel for participating. Thank you for all of you who joined us online. Lots of questions were submitted, and a colleague was behind the scenes writing lots of answers, so we know that we've been giving out quite a lot of really good factual information as well as your contributions. A reminder that the PowerPoint and this recording can be found on the YouTube channel of FHTA and on their social media. But my takeaway from this is, my God, this is complex. There is a lot to do between now and January, but we can't wait till then. We need to move forward together. We need to learn by doing, and the stakeholders have huge interest in getting this right, because everyone sees that there is potential in this. Everyone is committed to that main aim, which is making sure we make it easier for innovations to be both submitted, evaluated, and in the hands of clinicians, and in the arms and in the bodies of patients as soon as possible. Everyone has that stated aim, so there's a lot of goodwill that needs to not be dissipated with the transparency and engagement. And as we've heard there, the JCA is a new way of doing things. There are a lot of unknowns and uncertainties. We should, as the message was, we should get ready, but Robin also reminded us we should enjoy the ability to let go. We will be letting go of some of the things we've done in the past for a new process that should benefit everyone, but drop the fear of letting go. Yes, it will be a lot of work, but it will also reduce some of the things that used to do in the past. So my mother gave me great advice when I went off to university. It came from the name of a book, a feminist book that was called Feel the Fear, but Do It Anyway. So that would be our advice to all stakeholders and to regulators. Feel the fear, but do it anyway, and move forward together. Thank you all for joining us. It's been a really interesting afternoon. See you again in the future.